Tom, thank you very much, and thank you for having me here, and thank you for all the people in the audience and elsewhere who have published climate skeptical papers in my journal. I became the editor of this journal called Energy and Environment, which was, it's published in England. I became a climate, before I started publishing this journal, I was already a climate skeptic. I was a climate skeptic or a science skeptic on the basis of my PhD, which was in marine pollution, and on a lot of work and research I did on acid rain. All the German forests were dying, and I was told by a forester who knew exactly what had happened, and it was nothing to do with the emissions from the nearby power stations. So I was critical before I started to look at climate change, and I was actually funded by the British government for many years, 4 years altogether, and then I took on the editorship of the journal as well, to look at the IPCC. I was actually a reviewer of Working Group 3 of the IPCC. And I interviewed a very large number of people because the topic of our research was to study the politics and the science of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The results were such that I couldn't but become a climate skeptic, but I couldn't publish much of it because a lot of the information I was given was in confidence. I was also still fairly green myself, and I didn't want to cause too many problems to the British government, perhaps. But I published quite a few climate skeptical papers in Energy and Environment, and when the editor at the time, David Everest, died of cancer, he handed it over to me. Now, it's interesting, the origin of this journal. The origins of this journal were due to this chap called David Everest. Now, he was a government scientist for the British Department of the Environment. He knew, and I know quite a few people there who worked in this department since, he knew to what extent environmental policy was highly politicized and used by various interest groups, economic, ideological, for various purposes. The environment is a wonderful tool for doing politics. So he liked my approach, doing a political analysis, not just an economic analysis, and not just sticking to the natural science. So he handed this over to me to continue this climate skeptical approach. And just before I left, I had a look at one of the very early issues, 1992, and there is a report of a big conference, and there's a wonderful article in there by Richard Lindzen, and very little has changed since then as far as the politics are concerned. And so I wanted to put a plea in here as well. Don't just look at the science, the natural science, as a partly German. I know the language is important. In English, science is always used for natural science. In German, the word science, you can have a science of literature, a science of religion, as long as you look at in a critical way, a professional way, at a certain area of study. So science, and I wanted to show you something about this, the problem with climate change and science is not only with natural science. What I've heard not mentioned here is this enormous impetus the climate scare has given to the whole range of natural sciences. I just got a list here from a famous publisher, the Environmental Politics and Policy, Edward Elgar. Justice for Future Generations, the fragmentation of global climate governments, Handbook on Energy and Climate Change. I cannot get any energy books anymore, which also refer to climate change. Energy and climate change will become one. Handbook on Climate Change and Agriculture, the Global Challenge Encouraging Sustainable Living, Economics of Climate Change, Environmental Policy. I could get on. For history, international relations, climate change has spread right through the research arena in the Western world, and not only there. So I wanted to just warn you of this. And out of this comes my perhaps main contribution to the debate. I try to make a tough distinction, or serious distinction, between science as an outcome, a product generated over a long period, and it's not a political thing. It's extremely valuable, needs protection. But there's something else, and I think our first speaker mentioned it quite a lot indirectly. I call it the research enterprise, which is big business. and the research enterprise during the last few decades has become an increasingly dependent on government funding or private funding, as we heard the other day, the Big Green. Now, this research enterprise is dependent on giving the right answers. And I know a lot about this, how this happens, because the kind of research I did, you didn't write it for the research community, you write it for the users. It was actually in our contracts. You only got funded if you produced the right results for the users. In the users community, well, that could be big enterprises, that could be, usually it was the environmental bureaucracies, it could be your fellow scientists. So the whole research enterprise, and hence later on science, has now been diluted or influenced by the climate scare, and it's going to be very difficult to turn this around. Now, my own experience as an editor is it's very difficult, and I come here to ask for help. If you get papers which are scientific, natural science, and are critical of the global warming hypothesis, theories, peer review is very difficult. You cannot peer review, or it's very difficult to get peer review across this boundary. So the climate skeptical scientists will peer review climate skeptical papers and then get dismissed by the other side, and vice versa. I do not know how this is overcome, but this is a problem facing an editor at the moment. The other thing I'm very worried about now. I quote you one sentence I wrote a few days ago. I get a large number of papers, particularly from China, South Korea, Iran, from developing countries, because I spend a lot of time on helping young researchers, PhD students, to write their first proper paper. Now, that's what I wrote to a couple of them on one day. I'm fed up with papers that uncritically adopt the belief that carbon dioxide emission reduction should be the primary goal of energy policy. And virtually everything I get assumes this now. At least tell me this research is based on what the IPCC says, but not just quote the truth. Or the other thing, this carbon dioxide emission reduction is the only relevant environmental issue. I don't get any other environmental issues, and there are many, many, many of them. I only get the carbon dioxide all the time. And this is another problem for me. So the research submitted to me is mainly carbon dioxide related, and therefore I'm very pleased to get papers from climate skeptical scientists, but as I said, I'm basically a policy journal, and I only publish climate skeptics a little bit. Now, back to the idea that research is not science. Research is now a big business funded in Europe by the Commission of the European Community, and they will send you a research topic like how will energy policy improve the integration of the European community. The answer is always given in the overall research project. And instead of giving you a lot of freedom as an individual researcher, and that's why I pulled out of it in the end, you get a major, one chief investigator appointed, and he will then supervise his 5 or 6 research assistants or researchers who have no permanent position in universities at all. They only have an income from the research grant as long as the grant lasts. So the invitation, not to lie, but to massage your results to suit your funders or your users is very great. And I think I've looked at research in Germany, I looked at research in Australia because I've got an Australian passport and my family is there. It has affected the whole area, and it's very difficult to get this published. I tried this once or twice when I did the IPCC work. The first time and then the second time I tried again. I tried to put questions in my research efforts to individual scientists whether they would prefer to be funded individually by the state or from their income as an academic. Because I thought that if your money isn't directed to your research outcome, you might be more honest or less biased in your publishable abstracts and conclusions. Well, the first time the person I did the research with, and he was really in charge of me, he's a very famous non-climate skeptical professor now in Great Britain, he vetoed this question. And then a few years later, on a different grant, I tried to ask this, send questionnaires to major climate science researchers on this subject. And a certain Gavin Schmidt, somebody might. Have you heard of somebody called Gavin Schmidt? Yes. I didn't realize that he had this very strong position. I thought he was just a name I came across. He so rubbished my research proposal, put so many conditions on it, statistical ones, that I gave up. So I have no data at all on whether the actual people doing the climate science research actually want to be funded the way they are. But my recommendation is look at the funding systems, and I'm not the only one saying this. My conclusions. Only politics, ideological politics, commercial politics, bureaucratic competition, economic advantages can explain the nasty turn that climate science research and publishing have taken since the early 1990s. So, I would like to come to a conference where we discuss the politics of climate change and not just the natural science. The reasons why this has happened, I think, is because the importance of the carbon debate, carbon phobia, I call it, to energy policy and hence the power of the state. So that's what the real issues are: a competition for power, for exports, for resource policies, and as I said, especially energy policy, which is linked to all the others. This has been a disaster for science as an outcome, but has been of huge benefit to the rather unhappy research community. That's why I think that this distinction is important. The nature and implications of current research funding and publication methods, especially if they're related to controversial policies like energy policy, needs to be looked at critically, especially in the environmental area, because as I said somewhere else, the environment is the ultimate invitation to doing politics.